Call me Abraham. I am one of the 4 operatives responsible for the detonation and controlled demolition of the World Trade Centers on 9/11. And I'm going to be dying soon, they say, from all the particles and dust that I breathed on that day. There's something I want to get off my chest before I die. Now, I made a commitment to secrecy for the sake of national security and whatever. But this is a big burden for myself and the other 3 operatives who participated in the demolition. I'd like to give them a little closure and a little relief from their burden, which I'm sure is the same as mine. So, the backstory, in '93, when the truck bomb attempt to take out one of the buildings occurred, a lot of conversations in national security circles about the possibility that showed that that could have been a successful mission, and it could have caused the building to topple because of the way it was located strategically to take out one corner of the building. And if that were to have happened, there would have been a domino effect, and it would have taken out city blocks of people and buildings and infrastructure. So then also the thought was considered that something other than a terrorist attack, like even an earthquake or meteor, commercial airline accidental crashing into the building, might, even though the buildings were built to sustain all that, but just what if, one of the buildings was going to topple over. Well, the brilliant plan was, what if we rigged those buildings with explosives for a controlled demolition in advance, so that in the event of a catastrophe, and in the event there was this risk of the buildings toppling, we could bring them straight down. Of course, after they were evacuated, and the area was evacuated as well. So that's where I came in, we came in. I wasn't the first operative in my location. We were strategically placed in cover occupations. Even the people in our offices didn't know we were CIA, but and we didn't know each other. I was in the mayor's office. There was somebody in the New York Times offices, and there was somebody in the fire department and somebody in the police department, all with the same assignment I had, which was with information we were able to gather from our office and any other sources available, along with what we could see through our windows, because we all had been placed where we had a good view of the Twin Towers. Anyway, if in our determination or in our perception either of those buildings was at risk of toppling or beginning to topple and evacuated, we could detonate. Now, it was a quadruple blind system, which meant if I initiated the detonation with my remote control, nothing would happen. If two of us initiated the detonation, nothing would happen. It required all four from their various perspectives and sources of information to give it the go-ahead. And all of that, and that's what we did, essentially. We brought those buildings down the way they did, as you observed. And that part of it was successful. Of course, the buildings weren't evacuated. That's a complication, but there was no way they were going to be evacuated with people trapped on the upper floors. And all of that is not my confession. I mean, I have no problem with Project Abraham. That's what it was called. Project Abraham. Not after the president, but after the prophet. Those of you who know the story, you can make the connection. Anyway, I have regrets that the buildings were not totally evacuated, and the grounds around them were totally evacuated. And that kind of brings me to the point of what it really is that burdens me. I had many sources of information, and I could see what I could see out of my window. And the thought occurred to me that after a while, and after things seemed to be really out of control, I thought that it was possible that I was holding out. What if the other three people had determined that the buildings were at risk of falling over and evacuated or not, and they had already activated their controls, and it was totally held up by my indecision. And my indecision was not only based on what I was observing and not observing, but I really wanted to quit my job. I wanted to walk away, but I couldn't. So then I had this realization, which is what I'm confessing right now. The realization is this. I realized that if I activated my detonator in advance, it would defer the decisions to the other three people. And with the weight of the burden of that responsibility heavy on my heart and my mind, it was very much a relief to think that, wow, I could activate my detonator and that would leave it as a triple blind rather than a quadruple blind activation system. I thought, well, 3 is as good as 4. Now, I don't think I was going to handicap the blind aspect of the system, and it would get me off the hook. And so, almost involuntarily, in the middle of that thought and contemplating it, I actually activated my detonators. And nothing happened, which was a great relief. And so I knew all was in place so that the other 3 operatives could assess their data and their resources. And so I sat and watched in my office with the rest of the free world until the South Tower was taken out. And it was horrifying and also gratifying. Like, it seemed like a success of some sort, and yet it was still horrible. And there's no way it couldn't be horrible and successful. So what happened was I ran down the emergency stairway into the street, covered my face with my sleeve, shirt sleeve, a token gesture to protect myself from the dust. I knew it wasn't really adequate, but gave me permission to carry on and try and help. And just there were people covered with dust everywhere, and screaming and crying, covered with blood and dust and tears. I hesitated to tell you this part, but somehow I came back to complete this story. It was years later, and I had a realization that it's really hard for me to carry. And the realization was, what if the other three operatives had the same experience that I did, in that they decided to activate their detonators without sufficient information about the necessity and the criteria being fulfilled about evacuation and about the buildings toppling. And what if we were all cowards, and if we were all human enough to be overwhelmed by the responsibility and chose to defer to the other three?